Since we launched Across the Divide last year, we have focused primarily on Palestine and Israel. We have used this podcast to explain the political reality on the ground, to respond and critique harmful ideologies such as Christian Zionism that exasperate the reality on the ground, and also to highlight the voices of peacemakers, those people who are committed to the work of peace and justice. At the same time, we cannot ignore what's happening to the north of that land, the ongoing devastating reality and war happening in Lebanon right now. As of this recording, 2,412 Lebanese people have been killed, including 127 children, and more than 11,000 people have been injured. More than 1 million Lebanese people have been displaced because of this war, and also thousands of Israelis have been displaced as well. In response to attacks by Hezbollah, and despite many plans for a ceasefire, Israel decided to escalate its confrontation with Hezbollah. And so on September 17th and 18th, Israel orchestrated the explosion of thousands of pagers and hundreds of walkie-talkies, which killed and injured many people, including children and civilians. On September 23rd, the Israeli military conducted 1,600 strikes that killed in one day at least 558 people, including women, children, and paramedics. On September 27th, the Israeli military struck Hezbollah's headquarters and killed Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah. And on October 1st, the Israeli military invaded Lebanon for the fourth time in its history, in 1978, 1982, 2006, and now in 2024. And it continues its strikes in Lebanon, in the south, in Beirut, and throughout the rest of Lebanon. As we reflect on all of this, we have to remember that every life is beautiful. Every life is precious and essential. As it is in Gaza, so in Lebanon, Israel, and throughout the world. To unpack what's happening in Lebanon, I'm joined here by Marwan Aboul-Zelof, the pastor of City Bible Church, an English-speaking church in Beirut. He's an American Lebanese person with Palestinian heritage and who has been living with his wife and children in the Middle East since 2014. Marwan and I discuss Lebanon and its rich and complex history. We reflect on its vibrant religious communities and also on sectarianism and the harmful reality of division between the Lebanese people. We also discuss the Palestinian refugees who moved into Lebanon in 1948. We discuss the Israeli invasions, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and much more. We also spent some time discussing Hezbollah, which was formed as a response to the Israeli attacks on Lebanon. And we discuss Hezbollah's contentious relationship with Israel. And lastly, we reflect on what's happening in Lebanon right now. And Marwan shares with us how he has been trying to guide his church community through these terrible times and cling to Christ as the hope for what's happening in response to the devastation in Lebanon. Also, for those who support us on Patreon, Marwan and I discuss American exceptionalism and Christian Zionism and the role that they play in impacting what's happening in Lebanon and in Palestine and Israel as well. So here it is, my conversation with Marwan Aboul-Zelof. Marwan, I know this has been a very hard season for you with what's been happening in Lebanon, and I'm aware of the difficulty, the work you have to do, and the church community you're part of in your family. So very grateful for you for being here with us and having this conversation about what's happening in Lebanon. So welcome.
Thanks, brother. It's good to be with you.
So Marwan and I are friends. We've known each other for a while now, and we've been in touch since October 7th has begun. And I'm just very grateful for Marwan and the work that he's doing. And I thought it would be important to bring him as a Christian voice in Lebanon to share with us about what's happening over there. So Marwan, just to to kick this off, could you just give us a brief introduction about who you are, your background, and what you do right now in Lebanon?
Yeah, wonderful. Marwan Aboul-Zelof. I'm from this part of the world. My family name comes from the Levant, Palestine region. My grandfather came up to Lebanon in 1947. So I'm Lebanese and Palestinian, and have some Chaldean blood command. My mom was born in Baghdad. And so I'm from this region, grew up in the US as a result of the Gulf War. That's for another podcast. And 10 years ago, last month, 2 months ago, excuse me, we moved overseas. 2 years in Dubai, and the last 8 years we've been in Lebanon. As of a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated our 8-year anniversary, and we came back. I came back to this part of the world, and specifically to Lebanon, so that we can see a church planted. As I often share, the reason there's much Christian ministry that can be done, but the reason we saw a church planted, because God's regular means of making himself known is through the local church. And so that's what I do. I'm a lead pastor and church planter of City Bible Church. We're an English-speaking church in Beirut. And that church the church was planted just over 6 years ago, about 6.5 years ago now. And by God's grace, he has sustained us through much. And currently he is with us in the middle of these horrors that are taking place in our country.
What's your background like as a faith-wise? So you're come from an Orthodox background, and then your family converted to or kind of became evangelical. Is that the story?
Yeah, not a nominal Middle Eastern Christian, we can say. Some different backgrounds, Orthodox, Maronite, and in coming to the U.S., my mom's sister came to faith, evangelical faith, and then kind of through her ministry and kind of care for us, understood the gospel more clearly. And so the evangelical side, primarily because I was raised in Southern California. So I went to a Calvary Chapel church for the first 10 years of my Christian faith. And so nominally Christian across the board as far as kind of a Maronite or a Catholic Christianity across the Aboul-Zelof family. And yeah, grew up, currently would be connected with the Baptist, Reformed Baptist groups. But yeah.
Okay. There is an Aboul-Zelof family in Bethlehem area. I don't know if there's any relation to your family.
Yeah,
I know
relation.
you have relatives in Gaza as well, right? What's your kind of connection to Palestine right now?
Yeah, and so the Aboul-Zelofs in Bethlehem are my direct family. My dad's brother lives there. There's a barbershop in Beit Hur. I think it's is where you're at, right? So you might have visited him at one point. I also have first cousins in Gaza. One is still there, and the other has been able to come out to Egypt. But most of the family is just outside of Haifa in Shfa'mer. So that's where much of our family is at. Cousins, uncles, many relatives. And so well known historically for a long time in that part of the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's something beautiful in your family story and history, and something also so tragic. The beautiful aspect is that the openness of the Levant, of the Middle East, where families could move around in the area, and kind of there's that rich history of movement and culture. But then there's the sad realities also of the political reality, where your family lived. You said you left Palestine in 1947. Your family did, right? So that's before the war.
My grandfather did. Yeah. And so still some remain, but my grandfather came up to Lebanon in 1947. So not directly as a result of the Nakba, but clearly related to the issues that were taking place. And so yeah, there was a time, as you know, your family is from Palestine for generations. There was a time where there was unity and peace, and all kind of lived and traveled across what we now have as borders, but before just these different regions. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy is that, this happened in 1947. Your family left, your grandfather left, but then you cannot, it's not like you can go visit Shafa'am or you can visit Gaza. And there's that kind of brokenness in the family that you could have done it back at the time. But since Israel has been established, now your family has been fractured.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I've not been able to meet my cousins in Gaza. other family, different times we've been able to connect and be with one another. But no, there is an unfortunate separation that has come. And again, this is just one story. We're just one family. And we can think about how many people have been affected in these ways and much worse as well.
Yeah. And now your family, then the Aboul-Zelof family in Lebanon, is not part of the refugee Palestinian population. These have been naturalized as Lebanese, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I have Lebanese citizenship through my grandfather. At that time, early in the country, citizenship was available, and so my grandfather became a citizen. My father was born here in the country, and yeah.
Right. So this actually touches on another fascinating and also complex and troubling reality, which is the makeup of the Lebanese society. I'll let you talk about it briefly, but just from, as I said, that stage, Lebanon is very unique in the Middle East by having a very large Christian population. I think it's about 30% of the population, which is way above any other country in the Middle East. Like in Palestine, we're talking about 1 to 2% in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and maybe 5% in Israel. In Egypt, it's 10% of the population, maybe 11 or 12. But Lebanon has a huge Christian population. However, because of a history, and the audience could kind of do the work of understanding the Lebanese history, there's the Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided Lebanon and Syria, but then also tried to give some privilege to the Christians in Lebanon to be more of a French-oriented society. But then that got complicated later on, and then you have Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims comprising the whole society, and in many respects has maintained Lebanon as a very sectarian country divided between three major religious groupings: the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Christians. So that's all I can say for now. That's all I know. Anyway, so if you can tell us a bit more about the kind of the identity and the culture and the religious makeup of Lebanon.
Yeah. And I can add also, Daniel, that just like other countries in the region, the numbers are dwindling for different reasons as far as Christian numbers. So if you go 100 years ago, nearly 80% of Lebanon would have considered themselves Christians, not now 30, 33%, depending on the numbers. And so, of course, that's for various reasons. Some persecution, some issues with religion. Certainly, you mentioned some of the political landscape and the challenges, and it just in many ways, Christians have left for opportunity. And so I think the sectarianism, like many political ideologies, there is often a pure form that is sought and maybe has some hopeful benefits. And so there was this image, and again, don't want to get too deep into it. There's much information available out there. But how do three different groups, religious groups primarily, live together in kind of which structure of government works best? And so the way that it was set up at that time is so the president of the country is always Maronite. So Christian group, largest Christian denomination here in the country. And then we have the Sunni, who would be the prime minister. And then you have the Shia group to be the speaker of parliament. And so at times in the history that would work, or at least in an ideal setting, it would work where there are the proper representation. Lebanon is democratic, or at least has democratic principles. We have voting, general public votes for parliament. And it's those who are elected parliamentary officials who are the ones who vote for the president. Now, I mention that because often Israel is noted as the only democracy in the Middle East, which I think that's an unfortunate framing, and it's just not true. But also democracy, or at least the way that it's has played out over the years because of sectarian issues and the infighting and all these things, much tribalism here in the country as well. As is common regionally, there's deep corruption. Some of the deepest corruption in history we found here in this country, unfortunately, with the Civil War and those who came out from that to become leaders of political parties. Currently, we don't have a president, so we kind of have a stand-in prime minister, and we haven't had a president for 2 years. And so the country in many ways is broken, deeply due to corruption. And yet that's how the government has been set up, to have kind of all parties represented, in the government.
And this sectarianism and this corruption is a byproduct of, is that framing correct, which I did, which is to frame it within the context of the French and the British division of Lebanon, and the way they drew the borders that would have it, that included Shia and Sunni Muslims, and therefore complicated how Lebanon looked and therefore how it functioned, right? Is that fair? Is that the kind of the root of the sectarian identity of Lebanon? Right?
Exactly right, yeah.
And speaking of which, also which ties to that, which I want to talk with you about now, is the kind of the Palestinian, Israeli, Lebanese history, which is the Nakba and the Nakba of 1948, and what role that played in also in agitating sectarianism in Lebanon, because a lot of Palestinians moved or were kicked out into Lebanon. Many of them were Christians. I can think of a few villages in the north of what is today Israel, like Ikrit and Kufr Bir'im. These were Christian villages, and they were pushed out of their villages, and they're like a few miles away from Lebanon, so they moved to Lebanon. But the majority of the Palestinian refugees that came into Lebanon as a result of the Nakba of 48 were Sunni Muslims. So it also added and exasperated like a huge influx of this religious minority, or the Sunni minority, into Lebanon, and created some kind of a kind of instability, I think, in Lebanon. Maybe that's kind of not the best word to use here. But complicated these kind of sectarian identity, the sectarian identity in Lebanon. But the Lebanese, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon continue to be a very large population, still refugees in living in very dire situation, and in a very dire situation in the refugee camps. Also, there are two refugee camps that are Christians. One of them is Mar Elias. It's a Christian majority refugee camp of Palestinian refugees. And I'm trying to think of the other refugee camp. There's also a Christian majority refugee camp. But so there is like, you have Christian refugees in Lebanon for the last 76 years. And you have, now we're talking about more than 1 million or so Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And that's kind of from the beginning of the Palestinian-Israeli issue, Lebanon has been playing a role, an unfortunate role for many would say, in dealing with of what's been happening in Palestine.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it's important to just even highlight briefly, when we think of refugee camps, we're thinking tents, a temporary setup. We're seeing these things online currently where it's an emergency setup, but for 70 years, clearly these are now neighborhoods that have developed and have systems, and you wouldn't think of them as refugee camps based on what the impression a person has. But as you said, it's unfortunate then, it still is the case, dire situations. One question that often comes up is, well, why didn't Lebanon just bring them in, get them full citizenship? Now, of course, that's quite complicated. There's lots that can be said there. But again, these people, in the tens and hundreds of thousands, and not, like you said, over 1 million, they are Palestinian. And so just to erase an identity or just to be brought in completely kind of ignores the bigger picture. And that's part of the reason why they still have that refugee status. And again, this connects with the UNIFIL and everything else. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, like, that's just an easy way for the Palestinians to lose the right to the land. If they get naturalized as Lebanese people, then it's over. Then you're Lebanese, you're not Palestinian. And that's why the refugee issue persists.
It ends the plight of the Palestinian. It ends without any real, true resolution. And then it's exactly what's happening now. Let them just be taken anywhere, and they'll do better off, which in truth, they would be better than what many Palestinians have experienced. But that's not the answer. That's not the way we can move forward, just to kind of ignore the past. And so yeah,
the solution is justice, not normalization.
Exactly right. At least that's what we should be going for as believers. It's not, let's just end this as quickly as possible, but truly consider justice. And you brought this up, Daniel. I think this is where you're heading us in the conversation. Is that this didn't start October 7th or October 8th. There is much context that is necessary, is absolutely necessary for us to consider, because this does go back to the Nakba, and you have tens of thousands, hundred thousands, can't remember the numbers of those times, that came up from Palestine and have settled here. A couple of generations ago, people would have thought temporary. and yet it continues. And so everything is connected. And I think that's been one of my heartaches, is that these conversations are just shut down. Folks who don't know anything other than what they first heard on October 7th aren't willing to go back and to consider. And that's as believers, that's not a way we can move forward. And I know you've seen this, and we've seen it together in groups that we're connected to and people who have conversations. As soon as anyone does research, you realize the shock of the history. And that's important if we are seeking truth and seeking justice. Maybe you can redirect us back to Israeli-Lebanese relations. I think you asked something, but to make sure that we're back on that.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, and it's like I was just snickering here. It's like but those who support Israel are happy to say, well, look, the history of 2,000 years, they used to be in the land, and so they want to cling to history, but they're not going to cling to the Lebanese history or the Palestinian history.
It's a rewriting of history, or kind of highlighting the story. Right. And I think I've said it recently that depending on where you start the story, you can frame it however you want. And I think we want to be, as much as possible, again, speaking as Christians, I'm a pastor, it's what I do. It's my primary identity is not a Palestinian or someone who left Kuwait and ended up in the U.S. because of war, or I'm a husband of Marci, I'm a father of two. We're first Christians. Our identity is as those who are united to Christ. And so we need to hold on to that as a primary identity, and then consider how we can speak truth and justice into these different stories.
Yeah, I appreciate the framing, Marwan. I think this is fundamental in how we think and how we engage and how we think about the politics and the history, but also how we relate to our neighbors, also people around us, especially right now, the people who are suffering in Lebanon and in Gaza. And I think, you think that our Christian identity would be essential in how we think about the world, and not our national bias or our media sources would influence the way that we think, but actually a faith that is grounded in peacemaking and pursuit of justice would be the criteria that we use in making sense of the world around us.
And humility and repentance, if I can add. Humility and repentance.
Tell us more about that.
How much time do we have? I think that in my story, I supported the group that I'm now trying to speak against. Not even speaking against, but trying to highlight things that I know are difficult to see, because I once only saw a certain framing with my background in the church that I was a part of, very much pro one people as opposed to all people, or one country as opposed to the kingdom of God, right? And so I think there is a sense of humility, and I've had to go through that and say, wow, I was wrong. Or even easier than that, saying I'm wrong is really hard. And sometimes it's not an issue of right or wrong. Sometimes it's an issue of just admitting I didn't know that, or I wasn't aware of this. And I think that's what we need, at least in Christian dialogue, to say, I admit that I thought everything started because of this terrorist group, right? Or their, whatever it is, whatever news headline or video that someone saw, and everything started from that. But this is where conversation and honesty, and again, humility, to say, I thought I knew everything, but I realized that there is a Palestinian brother that I can listen to, Daniel, or many brothers and sisters who are in this region who are faithful to Christ and to his gospel, and saying, let's listen to them because they might have some insight that we've overseen. And so just to add to that, and maybe I'll end it there, humility and repentance. Again, this is a Christian life, right? It's a life of repentance and faith, and we trust in Christ as we are living in this broken world.
Friends, if you're enjoying this episode and want to support Across the Divide, consider supporting the work we're doing here through our Patreon page at patreon.com/acrossthedivide. By becoming a monthly supporter, you'll gain access to unpublished content and other exclusive benefits. Again, the link is patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Thank you, and back to the episode.
Thanks for that, Marwan. That's really a good reminder. I'm focusing on, let's talk about the history and the politics, and you're saying, okay, well, let's focus on the principles here, on the values, on the foundations.
You invited a pastor. You invited a pastor with bombs going on outside. I know the audience won't be able to hear, but I mean, there's ambulances. There's a drone constantly buzzing. We're talking a month, day and night, has been buzzing over it feels like our home. I told you, I'll send you pictures after, but there's about 1.5 kilometers away. Some bombing happened just about an hour and 30 minutes ago. One entire building collapsed, another one's on fire. So there's much happening. And so I think even for me, it's important to remember Christ in all of this. And we can get to him eventually, but just as a warning, you invited a pastor to the show, and so I'm gonna.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. I love that. But also, yeah, how do you do faith in the midst of drone attacks and collapsing buildings and a war? I think this is kind of the whole theme of this conversation, or in generally, how do we do faith in the midst of suffering and evil? And that's why we're having these conversations.
And maybe we can end on that, but we can get back to some politics and history, because it is important. Yeah.
No, I thought just for the audience's sake, it's good for them to understand the history and the context of Lebanon, to help them kind of make sense of what's happening right now. So, and for for the rest of the episode, we're gonna do some history and politics, but then kind of move forward to what's happening right now, and then offer kind of a Christian response to all of it. So yeah, I was just going back to the issue of the refugees. I just, from my visits to Lebanon, I've been there 3 times, and every time I go to Lebanon, I fall in love with Lebanon, and just I feel heartbroken for Lebanon all at the same time. There's a Palestinian poet, I think his name is Marid al-Barghouthi. He made this kind of statement that Lebanon, you love it 1,000 times and you hate it 1,000 times. And that's kind of how I feel like there's so much love and just love of the culture and the history and the people of Lebanon, but also there's so much heartbreak in Lebanon. So going back to the refugees, I think Ain al-Hilwa is the biggest Palestinian refugee camp, which is the first thing you see when you enter into Beirut, when you fly into Beirut. So you see that kind of the impoverishment and the tragedy of the refugees in Lebanon. I think there are 12 refugee camps in Lebanon. I mentioned Mar Elias as a Christian one. Also, the other one that comes to mind is the Dubai refugee camp. So these are refugee camps that initially started as Christian majority Palestinian refugee camps. Of course, now the demographics are a bit different. When I was in Lebanon, I met some of the refugees, the Palestinian refugees in these refugee camps. Just a very heartbreaking reality. Moving forward to what's been happening between Israel and then also which led, I want to lead the conversation to what led to the foundation of Hezbollah, so that we can understand what's happening right now. But Israel has always had a contentious relationship with Lebanon because of the existence of Palestinian resistance in Lebanon. Eventually, that led to the 1978 invasion of Lebanon by Israel, and they kind of took over a lot of the land in Israel. And then during the Civil War of 1982, the famous
took over land in Lebanon.
Took over land, which is a big issue, right? Invasion of land, and also Israel continues to control Lebanese land. But anyway, so there are a lot of things to highlight, and we cannot do this in the podcast to discuss this history. So maybe people can pause and go watch a video about the Lebanese history and then come back. But yeah, any kind of things you want to highlight for us about this kind of bloody, very messy history between Lebanon and Israel leading up to the foundation of Hezbollah in the 80s?
Yeah, I think, like you said, the history does speak for itself if we're willing to look to it and listen to the testimonies. Not just those who we agree with, but truly to listen to. And that's why you've heard me over and over again, and maybe for this audience, they haven't heard me speak about it, but the testimony of Elisabeth Elliot, which I don't want to spend too much time on here, but she is, an evangelical sweetheart, right? Most people, at least in the time that she was living before some of her memoirs and things came up, became a bit more disputed, but she is a faithful sister who is now in glory. She went to the Holy Land. She went to Israel. She went to Jerusalem specifically after 1967 because of the war. And she, in her book, In the Furnace of the Lord, published in 1969, she went with preconceived thoughts that she didn't even realize she had, and yet kept being confronted by realities on the ground and testimonies of believers and just observation for several months. And she walked away a supporter of the Arabs. You can read her articles, and again, so if there are eyes to see, as Jesus says, or ears to hear, the history speaks for itself, and it can always be framed. But maybe just even for the sake of time, we can fast forward to Hezbollah. Hezbollah was created after the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. That's how the group came together. And we can even go back to Hamas and think about who was the instigator, who was the initial aggressor, or what events took place prior to an establishment of a group or a response by a certain party. And so in Hezbollah, they were, now again, this is somewhat simplified, and we understand that during this Lebanese Civil War of 1975 through 1990, there was many things happening. I think it's, can't remember which historian, I think more rightly refers to them as the Lebanese Wars. It wasn't just one civil war between two groups, right? The North and the South, or the Muslim and the Christian, but there's multiple fightings, and we see how Iran came in and Syria and Israel at one point invaded and took over land. So there's much happening and much complexity. But I don't know when officially the occupation of southern Lebanon would be counted. Whether it's 78, they came in, I think somewhere around 1982 through 2000. So about 18 years to maybe a little bit longer than that. Israel was in southern Lebanon, occupying the land temporarily, which again, nearly a generation long. But Hezbollah came to its place of prominence and power, and was able to gain the support widely throughout Lebanon, because they're the group that ousted the occupiers. And so that there was no Hezbollah during the Civil War, at least not in the beginning parts of it, right? And so the different militant groups, but to speak about Hezbollah, and please do come back and ask me questions if I'm not clear. I think what's difficult as we consider Hezbollah is that they are categorized as a terrorist group. And I understand why. I know the reasons for that. I know the history. I know the attacks. But there is, at least in the Western mind, again, I'm speaking as someone who spent most of my life in America, there is an image that comes to mind when we think of terrorist, someone who is radicalized and will attack anyone at any time to accomplish their purposes. And yet Hezbollah doesn't fit that category exactly as, let's say, Boko Haram or ISIS or some of these other groups that we see are not connected anyway. They're just a radicalized group that are attacking, causing harm for their own purposes. Hezbollah, though they have a military and a militant arm, and they are radicalized, many of them would be radicalized religiously, they're also part of the political and social fabric of Lebanon. They are a political party. Now, again, there's some would argue that they've done good. Many would argue, and when I say good, meaning social services, building hospitals, setting up schools, these kinds of things. Again, they're a large group and large force in the country, and yet also with their connections with regional powers, have also paralyzed our country and brought much harm and disaster to us. And the sectarian system we addressed before is also broken because of deep corruption. But that's not just a Hezbollah thing. And hope no one hears me trying to sympathize or protect a group or another. But what I've found living here, and also time with speaking to others in the region and hearing from them and their testimonies, governments are deeply corrupt. Political parties are deeply corrupt. You can see it even in the election season here in the United States with both parties and the things they say and the lies and the agendas. And so I think what's very difficult is to just because a label has been put on this group, now it's as if anything can happen because they're not human. They are terrorists, and nothing they do or say is worth considering. And yet again, we need to be able to step back and understand it. I don't know if you saw, Daniel, Prime Minister Netanyahu a week ago did one of his, I can't think of the word, kind of public service announcement to Lebanon. He spoke in English. I think maybe he had other audiences in mind. But he said to the Lebanese people, turn over Hezbollah, and we will stop dropping bombs on your country. It's good for you, turn them over. So what's happening here? He's stirring up sectarian strife, which has always been a fear here in the country. Thankfully, the articles that I've read, the people I've talked to, we can see the prime minister for who he is. And so not believing those things. But imagine, Daniel, if I say, or if the Republicans, or the Democrats. You can choose, which party you're for. Says turn over all the Democrats, and we'll stop these attacks. How is that even possible? How do you respond to that? And so anyway, so all that to say is it's not like Hezbollah are 200 people who all dress the same and are all in one neighborhood, and we're all protecting them. They're part of the political structure of the country, and I think from the outside looking in, people would have listened to the prime minister and say, yeah, like why doesn't Lebanon do that? And so it's just, I guess the summary is it's much more complicated, much more complex than the media is allowing to see.
Yeah, and also Marwan, like if I was like as a Palestinian who's very familiar with this rhetoric by Israel, like notice also this is blaming the victim, right? Like he's saying, if you, the Lebanese people, do this, we'll spare your lives. But if you don't do it, then you deserve to be killed, right? Like this is a dirty tactic there. It's like the blaming the Lebanese people for not giving up on Hezbollah, as if also the Lebanese people can actually do that,
100%. So it's not only pointing blame and asking for something that's not acceptable, not even possible, but it's a way to set up cover and give an excuse. I mean, it could be argued that his political party that he's a part of is a radicalized far-right group that many in Israel would say we're not for them. And yet, should Israel, all Israeli citizens, anyone in Israel just be at the mercy of whoever is against his party? So again, it's very frustrating. And again, these bombs are a couple of kilometers away from our house, and thinking what lines won't be crossed. So far, they've all been crossed.
So just to summarize the background here, we're saying there's a complicated history of Israeli invasions into Lebanon. We didn't mention this specifically, but there are 1982, there's a famous Sabra and Shatila massacre, which was coordinated by Israel, but also done by the Christian militias in Lebanon, which is also a very complicated thing to think about. We can go back to the beginnings of the civil war in 1975 with the Beirut bus massacre against the Palestinians by the Christian militias, the Kata'ib, which I think sparked the civil war in Lebanon. But continual Israeli aggression and attacks into Lebanon that eventually led to the formation of a Shiite militia group that is saying enough is enough. We're going to stand up to the Israeli aggression. And like you said, Lebanon, Marwan, that Hezbollah has been seen as very successful. Actually, when I was in Lebanon, I was talking to a Christian, and he was saying that Hezbollah is the military of the Christians. They don't have the Kata'ib anymore. So Hezbollah is basically the protectors. Maybe this is controversial. I don't know how you feel about this, but he was making the point that the Kata'ib protect the Christians from other Muslims and also from Israel. But we'll leave that.
Yeah, it's so complex. Yeah, exactly.
But that's part of the sectarian identity. You feel threatened by one group, so the other military can protect you from that group. But yeah,
exactly. And that's where if we go back to really addressing the foundation of the problem, the root of the issues, right? If we are actually trying to address true justice, not just each political party's aim and objective, Hezbollah would not be where they are today. If there was no occupation, or if there was true peace and justice for Palestinians, there would be no reason for Hezbollah to be a militant group. But as of now, they're the only ones who are protecting Lebanon, which I know for outsiders to listen in, it's like how are they protecting you? They're terrorists. It's like, well, we don't have a government, partly because of Hezbollah's role, right? And we understand the deep corruption, but also the Lebanese army aren't doing anything. I mean, I remember I don't know if you can edit this out, but he said, I told you, hey, I don't know if you can hear this drone. It was so loud last time we spoke on the phone. He said, I can't hear it. He said, why don't they just shoot it down? Like, we are a sovereign country, and yet there is this sort of paralyzed position that we are. I mean, we literally all night long. Last night was a very deadly night, and many bombs were dropped, and in new neighborhoods, and one in front of one of the public hospital, Hariri Hospital. 35, 40 have died, including some children on the outside of the hospital, and we're just sitting and just watching these things with dread, much prayer, But we have no country. So that's why, just to kind of speak into, that's why many come alongside and say, well, we need a group like Hezbollah because no one else is protecting us. And so it's a very sad and frustrating situation.
I'm Cole from New Zealand, super stoked with this podcast and how your work is bridging a gap that our church just isn't filling at the moment. Such an awesome resource to direct people towards. My favourite episode would be the wonderful Lama Mansour talking about gritty hope, closely followed by Stephen Sizer's recent episode talking about Christian Zionism. I actually bumped into my ultra-Zionist uncle just the day after, and I think it's the first time in his life that anyone's pushed back against his warped theology. So very thankful for your podcast and the work you're doing, and I look forward to future episodes.
In many respects, you can connect Hezbollah to Hamas. And we're going to get to the October 7th and October 8th and what happened there. But in many respects, Hamas came out as a response to the failure of the Palestinian leadership, to the capitulation of the government, and to, obviously, it came out of the first Intifada in the 80s to respond to Israeli aggression and violence and killing of the Palestinians, and eventually grew to become a political party, ran in the parliamentarian elections, and can establish its own militia as a force to respond to the Israeli occupation because the official government, the PLO, has been ineffective, at least in the 80s and the 90s. So in many ways, Hezbollah and Hamas are connected in this kind of necessary resorting to violence or militia tactics in response to the Israeli occupation and aggression in the region. So I think that's a helpful framing there.
Yeah, helpful framing. And I think also it's important to know that other groups, both within but also outside, take advantage. I mean, there are many who are vulnerable, both in Lebanon and in Palestine, and we have groups that have no option, no protection, no hope, and so you're thankful for anyone who's going to give you some food or some protection to some degree. And so these are vulnerable, hurting people. Across the board in many ways, and so that's where these groups sometimes find their grounding and their purpose. And again, that's where for Hezbollah we think of it of the role of Iran and how they're speaking into much of this. And there's times where it's been very tightly knit together, both Iran and Hezbollah and Lebanon, and that's part of the issue why there's kind of proxy wars even happening here in our country. There's times where we try to untangle that, but again, all that to say is, it's not black and white. It's not so simple. And Christians of all groups should be able to step back and say, how can we rightly think about this? And what should we prioritize? Do we prioritize a certain government over another government? Do we prioritize one people group over another people group? Do we stand by our brothers and sisters who are suffering? I think Hebrews would say yes to at least that one. So back to you.
Yeah. Before we move to October 7 and what's been happening and what's happening right now, which is I think people are waiting for us to talk about it, I just want to flag also the 2006 war between Lebanon and Israel, and just a few hundred Lebanese were killed and so on, and a few Israelis. But also I want to highlight the doctrine that was developed then, which is called the Dahiya doctrine. Dahiya is the name of a suburb in Beirut that is a Shiite majority suburb. But the tactic that Israel has used, it's called the Dahiya doctrine, which is to maximize civilian casualties among the Lebanese as to turn the Lebanese civilian population against Hezbollah. So maximize destruction and killing of civilians so that the civilians would blame Hezbollah for what's happening. It's been reported by many that the war in Gaza, people are shocked, like, how are they killing so many innocents? How are they destroying so much of the infrastructure in Gaza? That the destruction in Gaza is actually mobilized or justified by the usage of the Dahiya doctrine that was developed in Lebanon, in Beirut, by the Israelis. And that's why there's such a catastrophic destruction of Gaza and also very high numbers of civilians being killed, women, men, and children in Gaza. But so I don't know if you want to add any comments about the Dahiya doctrine or the 2006 war, but if not, we can jump forward to last year.
What I can say is I can see Dahiya from my balcony, and they're using that doctrine there in Dahiya, and the destruction, the bombing, and I think much can be said there. And again, this is where it's we have to be intentional not to fall into anger and frustration as Christians, because we look at these things and we say, this is so clear to see what's happening. There's been times where an attack has happened and the third floor of a 6th-floor building is hit, and that's the end of that. And you kind of do a specific assassination, if you will, along with the family that's there, unfortunately. But then you have times where I can, again, see outside buildings collapsing completely, entire blocks being taken down. And so that just speaks to this idea of the doctrine that's been developed, the Dahi doctrine. The only thing I'll say about 2006 is that lasted a month, I believe, 31, 32 days, something like that. And everyone, I was not here at that time, but everyone looks back and says, that was nothing compared to what's happening here. Both in the numbers of deaths, the destruction. People look back fondly on those days compared to what's happening now.
Okay, well, dear listeners, we covered a lot of history here, so I think most of our audience is interested in Palestine, and that's why they listen to the podcast. I think this is a good occasion for them to also pay attention to what's happening in Lebanon, and that's why we're having this conversation. But yeah, if you are interested in to learn more about Lebanon, I just encourage you to find some resources. Maybe we'll include some resources, Marwan, also in the show notes for them to read or to watch stuff, and make sure to include that. But now let's move forward to October 7. I'll ask you, Marwan, at the end if you have any kind of recommendations for the audience to move forward from this podcast. On October 7, Hamas in 2023 launched its attack on Israel. And then, of course, this led to the war in Gaza. But Hezbollah decided to follow this tactic, which is to support, to basically weaken and stretch the Israeli military by also launching attacks from the north. However, so that happened on October 8th, so one day after the Hamas attacks. What's interesting, though, I think we need to pay attention to this, is that Hezbollah did not attack Israel directly. It attacked the Shaba farms, which is disputed territory that Israel occupies from Lebanon or from Syria. It's claimed by both Syria and Lebanon. It's a very messy reality. But anyway, so they attacked occupied land that Lebanon claims to be their own. That led to also some scuffles between Israel and Hezbollah in the north, along with what's happening in Gaza. And a few hundred Lebanese were killed, including women, journalists, and children were killed in that year from October 8th until today. And I think a few Israelis were killed. I'm not really sure about the numbers. But then eventually, if you look at the numbers, the stats of the attacks by Israel and attacks by Hezbollah, I think from my readings and as I was preparing for this conversation, about 8,000 attacks by Israel into Lebanon and less than 2,000 attacks by Hezbollah into Israel. So very disproportionate attacks for the last year. And then eventually in September of this year, Israel decided to wage an invasion on Lebanon. And also they attacked a lot of the senior leadership in Hezbollah and killed a number of them, including Hassan Nasrallah, who was he was the head of Hezbollah and seen by many as a champion and a strong person who was standing against Israel. And now we're talking about this is from today, we're recording on October 22nd. We're talking about more than 2,412 Lebanese have been killed, including 127 children. This is from the whole attacks of the last year, including the pager attacks and what's happening right now, and more than 11,000 people killed. So that's kind of what's happening. That's kind of the reality on the ground. Yeah, go ahead.
And over 1 million displaced.
And that's an important point. 1 million today who are traumatized and displaced from the south of Lebanon to the north. So yeah, if you can just give us what's happening right now, Marwan, in Lebanon.
Yeah, I think again, much can be said, and depending on who you speak to, they might highlight or emphasize one over the other. Again, I think I've never claimed to be a political analyst or historian, though of course we're aware of these things. What it seems like is that there was for much of the last year, a sort of tit for tat kind of response. 2 missiles, 4 missiles, 5 missiles, just kind of back and forth. Not much to report as far as compared to Gaza. Now, some say this was, I think it came in line, or is presented as this is support for Palestinians. There are many who would say Hezbollah had tied themselves to the Palestinian cause, but aren't actually helping the Palestinian cause. They're trying to push their own motives and agenda, which I think that there's certainly some truth to that. And yet there was this sort of just tit for tat. I admit that I was quite surprised at the, I don't know if surprise is the right word, maybe it is, at the disproportionate measures and how the group that the West would not have thought was more level-headed, at least in these measured attacks. There was lots of delay and much more could have been escalated, but it seems every time it could have gone over the top, there was a sort of surprised, what's the word I'm looking for? A sort of measured carefulness. And I was very thankful for that because it seemed like all it would take is just a spark and everything would blow up. And yet there was just kind of continued back and forth. Again, from my observation here, it seemed that there was one who was more heavy-handed than the other, and not just more heavy-handed, but more well-equipped. Now, what most will say is that there was a sort of miscalculation, thinking this tit for tat will continue, and then it escalated in a way that we couldn't have expected. There's a couple of times since last October, so we're talking 2023, I think twice that Beirut was targeted, kind of a specific attack on a Hamas leader or operative, some sort of connection that way. But then it escalated. The pager attack was horrific. And again, I think it's important to consider for those who are listening, if any other country would have done such a thing, there would be sanctions and horror, just a strong and deep condemnation, and rightly so. And yet in this case, there was sort of this, wow, how clever. That was pretty neat.
Oh yeah, it was celebrated as a smart, kind of cool attack. And it's an act of international terrorism. Like this is clear. Like you're attacking people in grocery stores, right? And children died because they were playing with their parents' pagers. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
And that, yeah, exactly, 100%. And this is the frustration again from here, someone who's familiar and deeply connected to the West, to be able to see how it can be framed. And that's been a big frustration. I think there's so much complicity happening across the board, from governments to deep corruption with politicians, of course, the media. And then unfortunately, I think there's a, maybe for another conversation, that the role of the church, the Western, specifically American church, in what they're supporting, how they're standing up, and being not discerning. Again, what you said, it's such a clear break of international law and international terrorism and violence. And yet there's always some sort of space where these things are allowed for Israel. And then the next day there was the walkie-talkies, and then just escalated. For the entire year, we've had sonic booms, which for many of us are more terrorizing. Well, sonic booms by saying the F-14s, F-16s, I don't know which airplane it is. Low flying, break the sound barrier, shakes the house. I mean, those have been in ways more terrifying because we actually think our building is falling down. And again, remember, Daniel, Lebanon is filled with a hurting people, both generationally, as we go back to the Civil War. Many, again, ended in 1990, so many people are still alive at this time who have lost direct relatives or lived through it themselves. Then we have the Beirut port explosion, which again was due to brokenness and deep corruption. Hezbollah had a role in that as well, as far as storing munitions and all these things. So we are a traumatized people. Loud sounds terrify us, and so what Israel has been doing regularly for the last year and nearly daily in the last couple of months. And like I said, there's a drone flying overhead daily and throughout the night. And so there is this sense of fear and anxiety that has been continually, but then there was a sort of like escalation from the days of the pagers. And then there was a hit here, hit there. we always expected it to be in Dahiya, in kind of the southern suburbs of Beirut. And yet there have been neighborhoods that we would have never expected to be hit. And again, this is part of the fear for many, where we look back to 2006 and say, well, Israel performed in these ways and they didn't cross these lines. And so we hope that will be the same way. But that's not been the case so far in this in this war and this escalation. The day that Nasrallah was hit, the entire city shook. We'll never forget that. The Telos podcast that I was on, I recorded that 2 hours afterwards, and so we're just still shaking, still remembering that. It was unbelievable what happened in the city. And then since then, that evening, no one slept because hundreds of bombs fell that night and just attacks throughout the city all around. And so there's been this sense of uncertainty. Like I mentioned, our country is a sovereign country, and yet we're kind of just, we listen to Israeli news for updates. We wait for them to send messages on Twitter, and they're shared publicly or widely on social media. These are the neighborhoods we're going to hit. This is the building we're going to hit. 10, 15, 20 minutes later, bombs come down. And so there's this sense of uncertainty, and there's no end in sight. This is what's concerning. Again, I think there's deep corruption in the West and even here that is allowing this to continue. And so we just wait. Really, there's not much to be said other than we pray and wait and hope this ends before much more damage takes place.
Hi everyone, I want to invite you to join me in person this December in California. Our friends at the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East are hosting their annual forum, and I'm going to be there. I'm actually giving a keynote talk on Saturday night. I'm also excited to announce that we're planning to record a live episode of a panel discussion for Across the Divide at the forum itself. It's going to be a great weekend to meet fellow peacemakers and have fellowship and learn from each other. You'll get to connect with Christians from around North America who are looking for thoughtful conversations about Palestine and Israel, and listen to Christian leaders advocating for human rights and for peace and justice, and also figure out ways to support each other and work together for truth, justice, and the flourishing of both Palestinians and Israelis. There's a virtual option to join the forum online, but it's kinda lame. Come in person if you can. I would love to meet you. The forum will be in Santa Barbara, California on Friday, December 6th through Sunday the 8th. Learn more and register at nemi.network/forum. That is NEME.network/forum. This year, we need each other more than ever. I hope to see you there. Yeah, it's really hard, and kind of that sense of despair and trauma is something that I, as a Palestinian, can relate to, Marwan. In many ways, Lebanon has such a complicated history, but it's in many ways connected to the Palestinian trauma as well, and we have this kind of mutual enemy that is doing this to us, and we kind of continue to be in this reality of despair and hopelessness and lament and grief. But then, having said that, what do we do now? Like, how does one respond to this? And also, for you as a pastor, how have you been trying to lead your congregation, your people, to think about this stuff, to analyze it well, but also to find refuge and find hope and meaning in through their faith in the midst of what's happening in Lebanon?
Yeah, I think one thing before I get too much about or kind of go towards pastorally how I've been speaking and the other pastors in our church as well, caring for our church and those around. I'll just say one thing is doing these kinds of things. You mentioned in the beginning, we scheduled this last week, and I canceled on you, at the 24-hour mark and say, hey, brother, I don't think I have the capacity to do this. There's just so much going on, lack of sleep, distractions. And so I think these things are important, trying to bring truth. I know what much of the media is saying in the West. And so I'm trying to upload videos and share thoughts and say, hey, everyone wants to keep saying that this is very complicated. And certainly there are some levels of complication. But I think if these numbers are correct, Hezbollah, in their attacks in the last year in Israel, have had 28 civilians die and 43 IDF. 4 of those were in Israel. The rest are happening in the south, the combat, as they're kind of taking over land here in the country, in Lebanon. My heart breaks for specifically the civilians. We know that there are casualties of war as far as military people are going to fight and die. And not to minimize at all, but these civilians, men, women, and children who have died, I see 28 civilians, people who did not expect for their life to end, and families that will be affected by this for generations. And yet, those numbers are quite low compared to what we are seeing in Lebanon alone. I can't remember what you said. Was it 2,800? Last night, that's maybe, I don't know if that's counting what happened last night. Last night alone, more people died than the year of what Hezbollah has done. And the numbers were low last night, 50, 60 people or so. And so just trying to highlight the disproportionate response and trying to just, again, people's ideologies are set and they're hard to change. But my hope is to be able to say, hey, have you thought about this? Here's this truth, and here's maybe a way that we can look at it as Christians. And my prayer isn't to completely change minds or hearts. I pray that the Spirit does that because I do think these things, especially Christian support and commentary on all of the things that we discussed previously, you and I, negatively affects the gospel. And it's heartbreaking. It's frustrating as a pastor seeing the hurt that it brings to believers in this region. But to be able to bring a sort of pause and have someone say, I hadn't considered that, and I see what you mean, that we should think about it this way as Christians. And so we try to speak truth and highlight things that maybe some aren't able to see.
What's the role that your faith, you think, plays here for you?
Yeah, I think I can even mention my sermon this past Sunday. We're going through the Gospel of Mark as a church, and I just finished preaching, middle of Mark chapter 14. And I was encouraging the church, just as so Mark 14, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he is betrayed in the next section. Those are the 2 sections that I covered. And I encouraged the church as we considered that passage, that our communion with God prepares us for the hardships of life. And we see Jesus laboring and pressing on in prayer. Lord, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, your will be done. And we see that we need to commune with God. So this is something I'm seeing in my life and encouraging the church, the importance of communing with God in order that we do respond by faith and in the power of the Spirit as opposed to our flesh. Because, brother, I can tell you, if I give in to my flesh, there's a deep anger and a deep hurt. And I want to be able to point the finger at this politician and this group and those people and say they're wrong, this is what's right, and just have a sense of righteous anger that will spill over to sin, because I know that I can't hold that well with all that's happening. And so just this push to prioritize and to commune with God, thinking again in that passage, how Jesus responded to his betrayal and how his disciples did, where Jesus submitted to God, to his Father, and the disciples fled. And so again, one thing here pastorally is just people asking, how do I not hate? How do I deal with the anger that I'm feeling? And so I think, secondly, I could say is prioritizing Christ and remembering our hope in Him. That we have a living hope because Christ is alive, even though I can admit this doesn't feel hopeful. I don't have a sense of hope as I again see smoke in a building that's no longer on fire, but before we started was still on. I could see the flames in the building. I see that and I say that's pretty close. I don't know how to hope in this, because no one seems to be doing anything to bring it to an end, and yet we rest in Christ and try to encourage each other to put our trust in Him. And lastly, in all this, just remembering God is sovereign. He is not to be blamed. No fingers should be pointed on him for the wickedness and the evil in this world. And yet we recognize that God is in control of all these things. And the things that we can't see or understand, we trust he's working in lives of believers in our church, to trust him in hard times, and to continually share the gospel with people who don't have the hope that we have in Jesus. And so that's how we're trying to look at it. We're trying to not fall into our flesh and get political and say this is how we need to respond to them, and this is the military action that's needed, but to rest in Christ, and trust him. Look forward, as we're told in Hebrews. Let's not neglect the gathering together, and all the more so as we look forward to his return. And so we try to do that. And you know what it's like being a believer, living under challenges and different kinds of oppressions and attacks, trying to balance how much to speak, how much to listen. And I think this is a time, that's why I'm doing this with you, and I know that's why you're speaking as much as you are. This is a time for us to speak, and hopefully others are able to hear us and hear what many have been saying for a long time, before October 7th. But since that time, I think, again, as we see the sovereignty of God, I think there's been opportunities that wouldn't have happened with all these things to highlight deep problems, historical issues that have been ignored largely for generations. And yet here we are trying to speak about it today together.
Yeah. I mean, there's an admonition there for sure for many Christians in the West who are apathetic to what's happening, and also how much of their ideology, Christian Zionism, has played a role in ignoring and silencing voices like yourself and Palestinian Muslims and Christians as well. But yeah, your faithfulness, Marwan, is so important, and very grateful for the work that you're doing in holding on to faith in the midst of suffering and evil, and kind of clinging to Christ and the hope that he brings us. So thank you so much, Marwan, for being with us. Your voice is so important. I'm so glad that you came on the podcast, and hopefully many who listen would also feel the heart of faithfulness and love that you have, and would also be motivated to speak up as well, and to elevate the voices of peace and justice in Lebanon and in Palestine and Israel. So yeah, grateful for you, man. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your heart and your thoughts with us.
Thankful for you and for all the content you put out. I've referred many people to listen to the history of Zionism and understanding the history of Palestine and Israel. And again, we need to encourage each other to seek truth and to seek justice, and in it all rest in Christ, and it be faithful in the ways that we can be. So thankful for you, and happy to be here with you, brother.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shahali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.